Hey everyone, this is Kestrel Raptorial, here to talk about the April 2017 issue of Smithsonian Magazine. So, I want to keep to the idea of talking about the major articles, so I'm not going to cover every single one. I'll leave a couple of the smaller ones out, although I still end up talking about most of them. So, the first one of much interest to me is a one-page article on page 19 about the first recorded birth of a scimitar-horned oryx. The species name is Oryx dama, in the wild in 30 years. An oryx is a type of large antelope that is desert and arid to semi-arid region adapted. There are 4 species, and this one, which is also known as the Sahara oryx, is the only one with curved horns. It is listed as extinct in the wild. There were efforts in time to preserve captive herds. The calf mentioned was born when the mother wandered off from the Wadi Akshim Game Reserve in central Chad, Africa. I pronounce it as best I can. This is those names are completely new to me, so I'm trying. It's in central Chad, Africa. Oryx were once widespread across Africa and the Middle East. Over time, their habitats were lost to human agriculture and development, as well as hunters. Frequent civil wars and other conflicts, people would go hunt oryx to survive. It's a large prey animal, and one kill can sustain a number of humans for a time. Their antlers are also trophies, trophy hunters, bushmeat, survival hunters. While being less dangerous than game than rhino or buffalo, for example. I recognize the name of the creature from the book Oryx and Crake, which I think I read in like either middle or early high school. I can't quite remember exactly when. Never did understand the message of the book at the time. It's a really weird story, especially for someone of that age. Kids that age are just beginning to be able to read books like that, but it's still really weird. But yes, the oryx is a real animal and is not yet extinct. There are slow but hopeful efforts to reintroduce them to the wild. There is another interesting one-pager on page 22 that talks about fake news, intentional fake news, being used between 1941 and 1943 from a broadcaster named Der Chief, or The Chief in German, and I'm sorry I probably can't pronounce anything right, but I'm trying. Created to spread false stories to disrupt the Nazi war effort. At the bottom of the page, there are other examples of fake news used throughout history, and they're pretty short, so I can quote them. The 6th century Byzantine historian Procopius secretly scribbled a collection of defamatory writings about the Emperor Justinian and other figures, who he glorified in his official works. When the writings were published, after his death, of course, they became known as the Anecdota, from the Greek for unpublished items, and gave us a new word for amusing but unsubstantiated stories. In 1782, the Independent Chronicle, a Boston newspaper, reported on atrocities committed by a Native American tribe allied with the British. The report even quoted locals who described finding American scalps left behind by the bandits as if they were gifts. But while the newspaper was real, the report was a fake, concocted by Benjamin Franklin, Actually, that's one of the first negative things I've ever heard about him. To gin up popular fury against the British. Paris in the 17th and 18th centuries was overflowing with printed broadsides called canards that disseminated fake news. One bestseller, according to the historian Robert Danton, announced the capture of a monster in Chile that was supposedly being shipped to Spain and had the head of a fury, wings like a bat, a gigantic body covered in scales, and a dragon-like tail. So, you know, news can be full of fake stories, full of over-sensationalized stories. It's really hard. Well, I mean, the cryptid is ridiculous. It's very hard for the public to sort through them, cross-reference facts versus, made-up things presented as facts. It's all very confusing. It's very hard to know what's true. And it really does matter what is believed to be true, because that can influence people's behavior. In fact, it's usually what is. Efforts to uncover the real truth are extremely hard. Probably even harder now. Even though we have more ways to investigate, we have more ways to deceive now. So, yeah, it's just a one-pager. Read it if you like. As for the fake news happening today, go check out Stefan Molyneux's channel. Go check out, InfoWars. Those are about the most honest. And I know, I'm not sure of the status of Breitbart these days, maybe. It's just, you want to look for people who talk honestly. As for credible sources, hard to say these days. But this was just a one-page article on page 22 of this magazine. Unmasking the Mad Bomber. From 1940 to 1956, a serial bomber, identifying himself only as FP, had planted 32 explosives in some of the most crowded places in New York City, including theaters, terminals, subway and bus stations, and a library. Now, in 1956, he began declaring his intentions in letters sent to newspaper editors, which pushed detectives to eventually the point where Captain Howard Finney and 2 bomb squad team members to recruit a psychiatrist, James A. Brussel, who was an expert on the criminal mind. This, the article claims, was a never-before-tried strategy to construct a portrait of the bomber's inner mind, although the first actual attempt at creating a criminal profile had been made 68 years before in response to the Whitechapel murders in London, attributed to the Jack the Ripper case. But that, of course, was never solved. There's some interesting discoveries today, but that's not what this is about. And as far as we know, no psychiatrist was officially included. Brussel was hesitant at first, as he had only had the experience analyzing patients either in front of him or of whom there was information on definitely them. Of course, keep in mind that this was a time when the practice of putting people into asylums, mental institutions for rather questionable reasons was only beginning to change. Instead of starting with a known personality and anticipating likely behavior, Brussel had to work in reverse for the first recorded series time profile a personality based on known behavior, or more accurately, recorded bursts and patterns of behavior. Again, the cases he had to work with, since the standards, the threshold for what you could be incarcerated for, were just beginning to be revised. So who knows how... who knows what kind of cases he started to work with. But he was known for having a talent for putting clues together, drawing inspiration from Auguste Dupin, the amateur psychological detective created by Edgar Allan Poe, and Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. So, he had inspiration, he had skill, he just... what he had to work with originally, I don't know. What he ended up doing was, from photographs of bombs, bomb sites, letters, and investigators' reports, eventually describing the bomber as a textbook paranoid schizophrenic. Although, admittedly, you now hear a lot of bombers, killers, and terrorists described as such. And I myself am not so sure they all are. It does kind of seem to be the first description people go to today. Although he did also hypothesize that the bomber obsessively went out of his way to appear squeaky clean when in public. Now, long story short, read the article if you want to know more. He was not quite as spot on as the article seems to read. The bomber, who was found to be George Metesky, fit the profile so well that the police did keep coming back to Brussels for help. Sometimes he failed. Some cases he had too little information to go on, but his deductions were right often enough that this was the starting point of psychology teaming up with criminal investigations. Next, there is a long and very heavily detailed history of the Liberty Bell, which would take way too long for me to even abbreviate here, but definitely read up on it. It's quite interesting. Mainly talking about the bell going on tour across the United States in 1915 to motivate people to buy war bonds to finance World War I. The reason this was not done for World War II is because all further tours were refused. The Liberty Bell was too badly damaged at this point, and they weren't just going to take the risk again. I believe the bell today is at the Independence National Historical Park in Philadelphia. Then we get to volcanology, which is of much more personal interest to me, being an earth and ecological scientist. Lava that spews from Hawaii creates new ecosystems that grow into islands of evolution. Squee. Now, the Hawaiian Islands are shield volcanoes. They are relatively gentle-sloped volcanoes created from a hot spot, which is an area on the Earth's crust where, for complex reasons, magma has emerged on the surface. It is not part of tectonic plate collisions, which is what births most volcanoes. The Yellowstone supervolcano is also a hotspot. It's just got entirely different conditions affecting it. Much more explosive rock magma. Also that it's continental and rather than oceanic, and just the mechanisms of the hotspot itself. Hawaiian volcanoes are some of the most gentle on Earth. When Yellowstone blows, it might well be the end of the human species if we're not smart about it, which humans don't have a very impressive track record of natural disaster response. Anyway, When Hawaii's gentle lava flows, those slow-moving rivers of molten rock that, you know when you see them, slide down the island. They break up the forest into little ecological islands in and of themselves, called kipukas. If you live in or visit Hawaii, you can go on a kipuka tour on trails like Kamana and Pua'o'o. Many species do not easily cross these lava trails, and so what happens is that each mini ecosystem diverges from the others and becomes unique. Even a lot of birds don't like to travel that far, and so what on one island starts out as a couple species can radiate into many, many different species, simply because as their preferred habitats become separated into these mini islands, they diverge enough to be separate subspecies and then species in their own right. Charles Darwin, who I've mentioned I don't regard as any sort of super scientist, as he's often either referred to as or believed to be held as by evolution studiers, was, to his credit, able to deduce that this is what happened in the colonization of the Galapagos Islands in studying the finches, among other creatures. In fact, on both small and large scales, this is how island ecosystems are built up. Continents are a little bit different because there's just so much, so many territories, so many different habitats, and they've got species that have always been there, rather than islands that can literally just either pop out of the sea or be created. In Hawaii, we see this with honeycreeper birds, also called apapane, as their populations are separated by lava flows. In fact, what's really cool is that the populations that are still of the same species of apapane that keep to different kipukas have been found to have their own bird song dialects, to develop their own languages, even though they're not, long before they are biologically separate species. Ooh, we get another Earth Science article. This one talks about some of the earliest fossils in existence, found on the small band of coastal cliffs between Cape Race and Portugal Cove South in Newfoundland. This is the Mistaken Point Ecological Reserve. The fossils are from the Ediacaran period, more precisely between 580 and 540 million years ago, the last about 40% of that time period, leading up to the beginning of the Cambrian period and the Cambrian explosion. One of these fossils is a foot-long creature that looks like a plant, but was actually an animal, called Charniodiscus, which alive would have been swaying on the seafloor like kelp. Another in this area is Trapecia, which was one of the dominant creatures in its ecosystem. 580 million years ago, this seabed would have been about where Brazil is today. Because of tectonic activity, the continents have moved quite a bit since then, and it's actually incredible that we can still find well-preserved fossil sites from so long ago, with all the huge continental collision, subduction, volcanoes, earthquakes, and it is amazing that anything survives that long. The article talks about most people becoming familiar with plate tectonics when they learn of the supercontinent Pangaea. Actually, Pangaea is only the most recent of between 3 and 5 supercontinents that have existed throughout geological history, and that's not including the times when there were several continents made up of 2 or 3. 'Cause we also have many of those. The Ediacaran period was long before Pangaea, which didn't form until about 245 million years later. The fossils found in this location were preserved when the creatures were covered by a debris slide from a nearby volcano, and a layer like that above them would preserve them extraordinarily well. There have even been sea anemone trails found in the rocks here. The Fig and the Wasp talks about a banyan tree named Thimamama marimanu, located about 100 miles north of Bangalore and still in South India. This is a fig tree with a canopy that stretches 5 acres. An acre is an area covering 66 by 660 feet, so 5 of those means a gigantic tree. It is sometimes mistaken by tourists for being the entire forest. And there are so many stories tied to it. Again, you just got to read the article. I can't tell them all here. What the article leads to, though, is the banyan tree's coevolution alongside a tiny brown wasp, the species Euprystina mesoni, which pollinates the banyan and lays its eggs. We see this with fig trees as a whole, that they have this symbiotic relationship with a species of wasp. The larvae develop within the figs, which are not true fruits, but actually a collection of inward-facing flowers. The difference is that flowers are sexual constructs in angiosperm plants, whereas fruits are for seed dispersal. It is not the fruits that get pollinated, it's the flowers only. So the wasps live and grow inside the figs until they are ready to emerge and fertilize a fig themselves. This is called mutualism in ecology. Symbiotic relationship does not necessarily benefit both partners. When that happens, it's mutual symbiosis, or just mutualism. The fig trees are pollinated by their wasps so they can reproduce, and the wasps lay their eggs and protect their offspring inside the figs.